Hello and welcome to Valley Girls, the bi-weekly podcast exploring everything there is to see, do, try, eat, and experience in New York's Hudson Valley by talking to the makers, the doers, the growers, the creators, and all the unique voices of the Hudson Valley. I'm Jenny Leifer.
And I'm Jennifer Santiago, and together as the Valley Girls, we're telling the Hudson Valley story one episode at a time. We're so happy you're here.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Valley Girls. We have a very special guest co-host today, filling in for Jen. You've heard us talk about him multiple times on this podcast, and his parents were our guests way back in episode 6, talking about Bannerman Castle. So I am very excited to welcome our bestie since 1993 and the newest Valley Girl, Brian Gotlock. Hi, Brian.
Hi, thank you for having me. And although I'm proudly Gen X, to put a year on it, 1993 is it's a long time we've been friends.
We have been friends for a very long time. We're a little old, but that's okay. But so happy you're here. I'm so excited to have you. And you live in Sleepy Hollow now, but you grew up in Rockland County. So you are the perfect co-host for our episode about Rockland's very own Edward Hopper. And we are thrilled that you recently took a field trip to the Edward Hopper House Museum to experience it firsthand for this discussion.
Yeah, it was such a treat to visit last week. A big thanks to Katerina D'Alessio. She was the museum's visitor engagement manager. And we had a nice walkthrough of the site, and I got to take some pics and walk around the grounds, which are pretty stunning. And for this particular episode, we're joined by Kathy Benowitz, who's the executive director of the Edward Hopper House Museum and Study Center in Nyack, New York. Just scant miles from my high school. Kathy, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, it's a delight. And I really enjoyed meeting you as well last week and finding out about your connections to Edward Hopper and Nyack, but also to have you come back and visit as an adult and experience it, because the museum has gone through major changes over its almost 55 years in existence. And we can talk about some of those things in our conversation. But this is great. Edward Hopper House Museum is the only official chartered art museum in Rockland County, although there are some other stellar art exhibits and galleries and places to visit. And to be on the western bank of the Hudson River where Edward Hopper drew and sketched and have those same experiences every day is pretty special.
Indeed, and I definitely saw that connection and felt the vibe, but we'll get to that later as well, the vibe that was in that space. So as Jenny mentioned, and I said to you last week, I grew up in Nanuet, went to high school in West Nyack. Our other co-host, Jen, graduated from FDR High School in Hyde Park, and she talked a lot about this on the podcast, about how they were so steeped in Roosevelt history from elementary school all the way through high school. And as I expressed to you last week, I was dismayed that it was very much not my experience with Edward Hopper, despite going to high school one town over from this beautiful childhood home and art center here. And that's wild to me, because I feel like if you only knew one famous modern American painting, it would probably be Hopper's The Nighthawks. Can you place his life and work in context for us with regard to his Rockland County origins?
Yeah, absolutely. So Edward Hopper was born in Nyack and born in the house, as you would have been in the 1880s, right? And it was actually his grandparents' house. They built it in 1858, a few years before the Civil War, and they lived there with the grandparents. And it wasn't until the grandmother passed away in 1890s did his family kind of take ownership of the house. And he lived there until he was in his mid to late 20s, somewhere between 1908 and 1910. But even there's suggestions that he commuted to New York from Nyack well into his late 20s and early 30s. But this was his home. This is where he learned how to draw. He probably had a pencil in his hand as soon as he could walk. And his abilities at a very young age to draw, to capture the geometries of boats and sails at age of 5 were really remarkable. And we had the opportunity of presenting Edward Hopper's Nyack years, as we call it, in the recent PBS documentary, Hopper, An American Love Story. And it really was for one of the first times that his opening chapter is put into the context of his entire career. And that's where we are really going with the Edward Hopper Museum today, is looking at that creative arc of his artistic development from childhood through young adulthood, and identifying the places and sites and perspectives that his feet on the ground in Nyack, whether looking out the windows from a house or walking the streets or being down on the banks of the Hudson, how they also inform his later legacy, right? So it's very important to understand where artists began. And a lot of times you just pick up at that chapter after they graduated from school, right? Or they had their first major show or something like that. And so we call it the OG story. It's the origin story of Edward Hopper. And if I can share one really fascinating interaction we had just over a year ago, year and a half ago, Annie Leibovitz came to photograph the house for Vogue. And she came on 2 different mornings at dawn because she wanted to experience the light, because the house faces east. So all of that spectacular light, that magical light that comes off the Hudson River, just floods the room, the house, but also his bedroom studio upstairs. And she said, "Oh my God, this is it. Now I get Edward Hopper. I understand where that sentiment is of, I want to just paint the light," because he grew up with the light. And so that's really what we try to celebrate and have our visitors experience. Even if you don't come on a sunny day, you can still experience it.
I love that. I love hearing about that. And that actually leads me right into my next question. Last season, we actually did an episode on Thomas Cole, and we had
Mm.
the pleasure of visiting the Thomas Cole Center in Catskill. And of course, Thomas Cole's an icon of the Hudson River School of Painting, and his work was completely of his surroundings in the Catskills. Was Hopper as heavily influenced by Nyack and the Hudson River as Cole was by the Catskills?
Well, that's a very interesting question. And before I directly answer it, I want to share that the Edward Hopper House, the Thomas Cole Center in Catskill that you met, and Alana just across
Mhm.
the way are all part of an organization that's called the Historic Artist Homes and Studios. That's a very prestigious coalition of homes that were once the studios of and homes of famous American artists. And it's run by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. So it's this national organization of almost 80 houses at this point. And we have 3 right along the Hudson River, which is a very special for people that live in this area to understand that within a
Yes.
100-mile radius, you can have these experiences of artists who grew up in the Hudson Valley.
And what they
I mean,
experienced, right? Like
and what
exactly,
they
and what their
experienced.
their views were,
Right,
literally what they saw
right,
as they stepped out of
exactly.
their house.
So Hopper is different in the sense that he drew upon his memories, he drew upon his experiences and how he recorded his observations through sketches, which is very similar between all 3 of those artists. I'm an American art historian as well,
Mm,
and I actually did a lot of work on Thomas Cole. And so they all start with a sketch, right? And
mm,
so when Edward Hopper was a young boy, he was given these sketchbooks and he would go out and draw and sketch and record what he observed in Nyack. Now, fast forward to when he becomes a more well-known artist, which didn't happen until he was 40 years old. I mean, so he uses the same mode of sketching and recording and creating studies for his paintings that he works out for his final works. But they're never exact representations of the place. Matter of fact, they kind of strip away the actual scene to create a narrative that anybody can then enter into, which is what is so beguiling about Edward Hopper's works, right? And there's a story that he's telling, but he doesn't really want to share it, and he doesn't want to share too many details. But what we are doing at the Edward Hopper House Museum is we've really kind of coined this Hopper's Nyack tours and Hopper's Nyack perspectives. So what we have done is identified places in Nyack where Edward Hopper had actually visited or experienced, whether it was the sailing club that he was a big sailor. So that interest in water and sailing starts in Nyack, but his paintings of it bring forth those memories and those experiences. where he went to school and where he went to church and places like that. But we've also have a second tier, which we've called the Hopper's Nyack Inspiration Tour. And these are places like Hook Mountain, which is the
Mm.
National State Park, just a mile-ish up the way, that he would hike and ride his bicycle and camp and made a beautiful watercolor that's in the Whitney Museum around 1900. And so that is one of our inspiration pieces. There's a famous painting at the Whitney called 7 a.m. that really is hauntingly similar to what was a butcher shop in Upper Nyack. And so we articulate those similarities. And most importantly, downtown Nyack, with its brick 2 and 3 story commercial rows of buildings, it pays tribute to the architecture that he's drawn to capture in New York City. He's never interested in the high rise. He's only interested in that horizontal line of buildings. And another painting at the Whitney that is one of his masterpieces is Sunday Morning. And the relationship between the view of those brick storefronts and downtown Nyack is just really incredible.
Mm.
I had a very good friend who's in the museum business and had never been to Nyack before. And she came and she goes, "Oh my gosh, and now I feel like I've walked into a Hopper painting," because Nyack has not changed. I mean, unlike Westchester, unlike many parts of Fairfield County or Bergen County that have been gentrified, downtown Nyack is as it looks as it did in Hopper's time. So it's this very unique opportunity to go visit Nyack, experience the whole village, to come to the house, and to see those connections between Hopper's interest and what he does later.
So interesting. So yeah, obviously inspired by, influenced by, but different than Thomas Cole. And as you mentioned, Olana, that would be for Frederick Church, where they
Right.
painted the landscapes. And actually, Church
Right.
was, of course, a student of Thomas Cole.
Yes.
So they painted what they saw. They painted the landscapes of nature. But it's just so fascinating how Hopper takes that inspiration from what he saw, and like you said, sketched, recorded, and turns that around into something that, as you mentioned, he's telling a story that it doesn't want to quite tell you the whole story. It allows for a little bit of room for the viewer
Hmm.
who's looking at the painting to kind of create their own
Hmm.
story with it. And it's just incredible. Yeah.
Well, it's also the story outside of the frame. The narrative keeps continuing outside of that. We just did a program last week on Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window and
Mm.
drawing the comparisons to Hopper. We currently have a show up through the end of April called Portal, The Window in American Photography. And the role of the window in Hopper's work is really an important pictorial device. It's also something that is reinforced by the house and the architecture of the house and the views in and out and down to the river. So there's so many parallels. So we thought it'd be fun to add this other dimension of cinema in a kind of a talk back format for this show.
Yeah. Love that.
Well, I'm going to turn back to decidedly not Nyack set piece of his, the very iconic Nighthawks, which I think was modeled after a Greenwich Village diner that he knew. And I had read that they expanded the scope of the building that it was modeled by, but not Nyack, but it still has some of those same motifs that his other works do. So for those that don't know, or just as a refresher, it's a late night scene of a couple sitting in a coffee shop, but the perspective is from the outside looking in. And again, we see that in so many of Hopper's works. New York Movie, Automat, Night Windows. The observer is at a remove from the subject, and they seem unaware of being observed. So, what does this through line of his paintings tell us about his work and about Hopper himself?
That painting is at the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's important to note that the over 3,000 works of art by Hopper are at the Whitney Museum, which is why they have held of late a major retrospective of his work that deals with New York. But that painting is iconic and it's been parodied. I think and during the pandemic, there was a saying, we're all living in an Edward Hopper painting because that sense of isolation that people have. I think Edward Hopper is focused on the individual. He creates these interiors that both give people space on the inside, but yet capture them and create this dynamic of controlled space and tension in space. And even Nighthawks, there's no real way for you as a viewer to enter into that diner nor leave. The only door that you see is for the wait person to go into the rear kitchen. So there's this dynamism and this tension and this emotion that's around his paintings. I think that you see that as he develops his voice, right? And New York Movie is a great example of that too. In the 20s, he's really found that. Prior to that, he was working in watercolor and painting paintings of houses in Gloucester and Maine and different locations. And those two, they harken back to his connection with architecture in Nyack, but the houses are portrayed not as just a representation of a house. They carry a story, they carry a narrative. They are also given the names of the house owner so that there's something that you're curious about, right? And there aren't people, there are no people in those. They're absent, they're void of people. So then when he brings the figure in, it's always in a singular or maybe with one other individual to a couple. I think that some of the tension between people, he wasn't known as the most chatty kind of, his wife was, but he was not thought of as a very social person. And people have said that he was very isolating, a man of few words, was also not. He and Joe had a tense marriage, even though it lasted for 43 years. But in his own home, because we have photographs of Hopper over the years, he was very involved in the community, as were his parents, very involved in church activities, particular, which he kind of abandons the organized religion as an adult when he moves away from Nyack. But he had a group of friends that he cycled with, that would go sledding with, and he had his clutch of kid friends, and they sailed together, and there was a connection. But family life was also hard. It was dominated by his grandmother and his mother, who were supportive of him, but were, from what we have read and been told, very strong personalities. And his father was not that successful. So I think life was hard, money was tight, and there wasn't a lot of communication, I think, on our interpersonal level. We have these really interesting caricatures, if you will, that Edward Hopper drew of his family life. And this was a device that he continued in his marriage with Joe. So whenever there were times of maybe joy, but also being upset, he went to his pen and pencil and created these cartoons or caricatures, kind of expressing the emotion of the moment. That is a device that other artists at the time were also using, but it does give you a sense of a peek in, if you will, to life at home. What's interesting on this note is that in the catalog of the Hopper New York show, Ferris Wabe, who's the head archivist at the Whitney and manages their research collections, they have letters from Hopper to his sister, Marion, who lived in the house until she died in 1965. And he said that there were reporters snooping around and wanting to know about life in Nyack. And he said, don't tell them a word. So that was kind of interesting, right? But his mother and his family saved all of his papers. So there was something that they understood and they captured. So we're starting to find out more about family life and his life and interactions with people, which is so opposite to what you see in his painting.
Yeah, and that you mentioned the comic strip is something else I was going to ask about because, as we were saying, and as I learned when I was walking around and hearing you just speak to it now, there was almost this austere vibe to his upbringing and the house itself, and even in his later works, there's this almost a severity to them. So it was really enlightening and almost reassuring that he had this. Sometimes it seemed like a very wry, witty, like a dry wit and pretty solid sense of humor. And I think that's borne out the most in that anecdote about the Time magazine portrait of him that his wife thought made him look goofy because he has a little tiny curled lip with the hint of a smile. So I love that correspondence where she wrote to her friend complaining about the portrait of him that was on the Time magazine. Maybe it was Life, but one of those magazine covers.
It was Time.
Okay. And what also really jumped out at me where I was saying the vibe in the house is very strong. And in particular, I totally get what Annie Leibovitz was talking about the electricity in that room. I also went at a good time, I think. It was sort of peak sunlight. So it was just really great to spend some time alone in that pretty modest room and just enjoy what I feel his inspiration was when he was living in the Hudson Valley, for sure. And what I also thought was surprising was that he was so invested in the community, because again, a lot of the works that I knew of Edward Hopper tended to not be, or at least it seemed to me that it was all very urban and not born out of some childhood in where I grew up in the suburbs, basically. So that's what impressed me the most about him, that he was such a man about town that also had this sort of seriousness to him, but also a levity that maybe had to sort of prod a little to get out of him.
Mm-hmm. No, and we've recently come into possession of a document called Nostalgia that one of his best friends wrote about growing up in Nyack, and there are these gems of little insights into that about town piece, whether it was them sailing or their love of fire engines, which would roar up and down North Broadway, and the toy engines that they would play with and catch things on fire and pretend to put out and things like that. So, there's a lot of these little anecdotes that we're getting ready to share. We're actually going to be launching, definitely by the beginning of May, but hopefully in mid-April, a very fascinating guide to the museum on what's called Bloomberg Connects. It's run by Bloomberg Philanthropies, and there are over 800 museums around the world. And we were accepted into the program. We've just finished developing the content, and we just have a release date of mid-April. And we're going to do something publicly about this, but it will be a really great tool for people to enhance their experience further, because it'll have audio clips, it'll have additional images, referencing images, more famous Hopper paintings that are not on view at the house. I think it's important for people to know that we have original works of art by Edward Hopper that deal with his Nyack years, and a few studies and etchings that are on loan from private collectors. But all the major paintings are at the Whitney and other major museums. But this app will give the ability to take you to those paintings and find connections. And those tours that I spoke about, we've also developed them for the app. So we have like a highlights tour and an inspiration tour. So you can take the tour from your chair at an airport, or from Paris if you're on vacation, or in Nyack at the Edward Hopper House, which is going to be really, really cool. I think it'll help people learn more about this larger connection with Hopper to his career and legacy.
That's really exciting. That's great that you're going to be part of that program. And Brian, the few things that you said that really stuck out for me, and I know when we were talking the other day about your visit there, about the museum, I'm curious. I know you talked about the humorous, sort of lighthearted side of Hopper and the comic strips, just the general vibe. What do you think struck you the most, or was the most interesting or surprising about the museum? Is there anything else that you feel like stuck out for you?
Again, the fact that I never really associated the Hudson River School with where I grew up, about 5 miles away from the Hudson River, it just is beyond me. And I was telling Kathy last week that Cropsey was the painter that we heard about the most. And I don't know if that's because he was from Nanuet, New City, where I grew up. And, just Edward Hopper being a hop, skip, and jump away, no pun intended. We weren't really privy to his history. So that's what impressed me the most, that someone who's so iconic, who produced these amazing, sensational, he enjoyed a lot of success in his lifetime, and that started all in this, what was then a relatively little town, that's continued to be now a bustling. And I knew growing up that it was the center of the sort of art world in the area in the lower Hudson Valley for sure. And Kathy, I know when I was there, I had asked you, and you guys showed me all the different programs you have going on with the kids, like the Girl Scouts coming in, and there was a beautiful craft room. You can write notes to the museum and Edward himself, if you're so inclined, on an easel. In another room that has some artifacts on display, which is fascinating. I love that stuff. I read every single plaque at every museum. It drives my family nuts.
He does. I can say that we've been to museums together.
I'm trying to grow in my advanced age. So that portal, the beautiful photography exhibit, is but one of things that you guys
Yeah.
put on. And I know you spoke of it earlier, and I know it's closing April 27th. Is there anything you want to add about it?
Yeah, well, I think that what's most important is that coming to Edward Hopper House Museum is not a one-time thing, right? I mean, you can come and you can get that vibe of Edward Hopper. But what we do, because we're an active art museum, is that we have changing exhibitions. And all of our exhibitions connect to the either visually, philosophically, or through the legacy of Edward Hopper. So Hopper becomes like, if you're on a diving board, right? It's a springboard to all these different things. It launches you to explore other pieces. So this exhibition that I mentioned, and thank you for noting it is closing April 27th. It's actually a show that was loaned from the Everson Museum of Art in Syracuse that they did and opened in the spring of 2020. Well, not that many people saw it. So I heard about it and I immediately thought that this would be a connection. And so we pared it down, we curated it to connect with Hopper and with the house. And the images that were chosen were deliberately done so, and also to fit in our two jewel-like gallery spaces. And then to make it even further Hopper-centric, we incorporated original Hopper drawings in connection with the works of art, the photographs. And then you see kind of parallels between the way of looking and framing scenes and composing the image that are shared by photographers and a painter like Edward Hopper alike. So it's been very, very successful. And we got a great call out in Art Daily on it when it opened in January. And that's along the lines that we're doing. We have a really exciting slate of exhibitions coming up. We're about to announce one by a Japanese-American artist of note whose work from his studio in Greenpoint, Brooklyn. His name is Tomokazu Matsuyama, and his website is matsu.net. He is doing a large-scale painting after Edward Hopper's Morning Sun at the Columbus Museum of Art. And we are premiering it in Nyack at the Edward Hopper House on June 18th through October 5th of this year. And then in the fall, we're going to be opening a exhibition called Side by Side with two husband and wife artists, John Imber and Jill Hoy, who painted in plein air together, and Edward Hopper and his wife, Jo Nivison Hopper, who our collection represents her work as well, did just that. And that'll coincide with a plein air festival that we're going to be doing in October. That'll be for family and artists to come in for a whole week of sketching and painting throughout Nyack. So we do these things that activate the messaging and the programming, in addition to kind of after school programs for students and Girl Scouts, as you mentioned. Our Hop into Art Lab is that quote unquote craft room. It's open whenever the public hours are, and we have art activities that are about Edward Hopper that are up there, or the exhibition. And it's not really just for kids. Many adults are up there and grandparents, and it's wonderful to see multi-generational groups up there drawing and doing different things. So it's meant to be an enriched, rounded out experience by having these different programs, lectures, film nights. And then our garden in the back is part of the original property. I used to go even further back to Marion Street, but there's a community stage that's back there. And it's really a fixture of summer culture because of this jazz program that's been going on for 45 years. And we do other staged readings and events like that in the back. So there's a lot going on. We have a very small staff, but we keep the energy going. And on top of that, we do fundraisers. We have a benefit coming up June 1st to help support the house in these days, especially with grant funding being cut. We're having to look at more and more ways to raise the revenues and operations funds to put on all of these events and also to take care of the house. which is really, really important. That's our number one object in our collection is the house itself.
Yeah, you mentioned a few things about the town, the community, and I'm going to ask you a question about that in just a moment. But you also brought up his wife Jo a couple times, and this will be my last Hopper related question, not my last question, but my last Hopper related question. I am always interested in digging deeper into women's history. I guess my question is about the role his wife played in his art and in his career. Can you tell us a bit about Josephine?
Absolutely. I want to mention, as I did before, that he grew up in a house kind of dominated by strong women, right? His mother and grandmother. Well, he married a woman that was very strong and very impactful. And if it wasn't for those bookends of both of those female figures, he may never have been who he ascended to be. It took his mother to encourage him to support his drawing, to buy the materials, and his parents to encourage him to be an artist and not a banker and not a whatever, not in the profession of Nyack. But yet they were very practical and wanted him to become an illustrator because that was a way of earning money. Once he pursues his fine art and he meets Josephine in 1923 when they were both around 38, 39 years old in Gloucester. Gloucester was a destination for artists and they met in Gloucester. She had been there independently painting. She, like Edward, studied with Robert Henry at the New York School of Art, but at different times. But she was very serious about her work. She was very much a modern bohemian woman of Greenwich Village, not having married. She was a teacher and had gone to what is now Hunter College. But she was also an actress. She was very involved with the Washington Square Players, which was a very progressive group that splintered off to become, in the summertime, the Provincetown Players. And so they met, and he stood some 6'5", her maybe 5 foot. So, that kind of dynamic. And they married the next summer in 1924. Matter of fact, last summer was their 100th wedding anniversary. We're still celebrating that through this summer. And she was a painter in her own right. But once they got married, she became Mrs. Everett Hopper, and that was in with tradition. She was still pursuing her own art because she was actually more well known than he, but gradually puts her career on hold or aside to support his. She was his only model after meeting and marrying. So all the women in all his paintings start with her figure, but yet he changes their persona. But that's Jo. She was his business manager. She was his contacts with collectors and gallerists. She was very sociable and countered his antisocial nature. So she really helped him succeed. She kept his record books. And matter of fact, the Brandywine Museum, which honors the legacy of the Wyeths, in a catalog that was done 2 summers ago on Andrew Wyeth and Edward Hopper in Rockport, Maine, there's a chapter on Betsy and their relationship as husband and wife. And Betsy Wyeth writes to Josephine to ask how to be Mrs. Andrew Wyeth. What do I need to do to support my husband as an
Hmm,
artist, as a major figure? And one of the first things she said was keep track of the works of art.
that's
So there's a lot to Jo. There's a lot to her work. She, like many artists' wives, was considered a lesser light, but there's been major works done on her. She was featured in the Hopper New York show. We lent 2 of her watercolors at the Washington Square studio to that Whitney exhibition. There was a major show at the Cape Ann Museum in Gloucester, Massachusetts, 2 summers ago. And because of Jo's importance in the Gloucester story, they created a whole chapter and section of the exhibition dedicated to her. And one of our guest curatorial colleagues, Elizabeth Colery, is writing some new articles for Women's Art Journal on Jo that'll be coming out this spring and fall. And Gail Levin, a Hopper scholar, has also written on Jo. And there's a lot to her. And one of our collection highlights is that we have over 50 of her watercolors. And while none of them were connected to Nyack or being done in Nyack, it helps us by having them, we were able to launch the story forward in Edward Hopper's time. So it doesn't just limit our discussion to Edward Hopper's childhood. It allows us to make those connections.
Yeah.
And we're exploring some exhibition ideas with some other contemporary artists to show Joe's work in connection with them, especially around certain subject matter, which will really, I think, add even more interest to her story. But she's fascinating.
Yeah, sounds fascinating. I'm going to
And
look more about her.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, well, you are just a wealth of information. It's amazing. You can see the art historian coming out there.
Oh,
It's
well,
just,
thanks.
yeah, it's just incredible the amount of information.
Yeah, we have a catalog. We did a show when I first joined in the fall of 2021 called Edward's Muse, and it was about their
Mm,
painting side by side. And you can see that their painting relationship evolved over time so that they would sit at the same site, one lawn chair on the left and one on the right, and paint the same scenes. And we did a little
wow.
catalog of that, and I'm happy to send you a copy
I
when
would love that. I would
this,
love to
yeah.
see that. Yes, please. Well, I'm going to pick your brain about something else. It's actually a question for both of you right now about the museum setting right in Nyack. Brian, I know you said the house is right around the corner from Main Street and fun cafes and galleries and bookshops nearby. Our listeners for Valley Girls podcast are spread out all around the Hudson Valley, even up into the Capital District. And many like to do day trips in the region. What are some of your suggestions for visiting the Hopper House Museum and then making a day of it in town? And this is for both of you.
Okay, I'll go first. So there's two really incredible resources for learning what's going on in the town or in the area. And one is Visit Nyack, which is its own nonprofit. And it really is the public organ, if you will, for what's going on. And it connects the chamber and the businesses. It's its own organization.
Right.
And they have a very robust website that lists all of that, as well as a newsletter that you can subscribe to find out those things. Also, the Arts Council of Rockland County, or ACOR, also has a really wonderful arts calendar that they keep that the community can post on. And it really is a tremendous resource as well for those kinds of things. Also, Rockland County has an Explore Rockland tourism page where different events and different places within Rockland County are part of. Another great art destination is Rockland Center for the Arts, and they also have great exhibitions and whatnot. Next door to us is a new gallery called Lawson Perry Fine Art Gallery, and they're also program incredible exhibitions and other events in their rear garden as well. And that was started by a former curator at the Edward Hopper House and former board member. And it's a really stunning women-owned fine art gallery of contemporary artists, both from the area as well as from New York and more. And also the Garner Art Center up in Garnersville. There are studios to visit, there's restaurants, brewery, all kinds of stuff. It's 20, 30 minutes up the road. The Haverstraw Brook Museum is also a really fascinating place. It talks about the legacy of brick making that fed the bricks for New York City and the barges that plied the Hudson. Those are all good things. And one thing I haven't done yet, and I really want to do it, is just walk the bridge. It's a
Mm,
3 mile bridge, so you can make it a 6 mile, get your steps in. But that is also an amazing experience to be able to be out there. And the
that's great.
Clearwater cruises to get out on the Hudson itself is pretty
That's a great idea.
fascinating.
Yeah, great. So much. Brian, do you have anything to add for that?
Well, first of all, I can attest to how beautiful crossing the bridge is. I run very frequently, mostly on this side of the river, but I do touch down at the Rockland landing of the Cuomo Bridge, which is stunning. Even if you walk out a mile, there's all these, I think there's 6 viewing points for the pedestrian path, and it's absolutely stunning. And I don't know if it's the Sleepy Hollow in me, but I love cemeteries. And I didn't get a chance to, but I would love to visit the Oak Hill Cemetery, which is nearby, near to the house where Edward Hopper is buried. And as a bit of trivia, both Helen Hayes and
Mm,
Carson McCullers are also buried there. So it's very iconic for these really renowned artistic talent. And again, it's actually a lovely river facing cemetery. So it's not quite Sleepy Hollow Cemetery, but it's pretty special.
Listen, I get it. You don't usually hear people describe cemeteries as lovely, but you're adorable. And yes, I will definitely check it out.
Well, and this one is very cool because it's up on a major hill. I mean,
Mm,
it's quite a hike from the house, but you can enter it, drive around. But it's also the most appropriate resting spot for Edward Hopper because it looks out over the Hudson, just
mm.
as he was born, and it's really beautiful. And yeah, it does have a lot of luminaries buried there.
And we were alluding to earlier about all the activity on Broadway and Main Street. And again, growing up, we in high school used to come to Nyack all the time. They're famous for cafes as well as the art scene. And there's just always something going on. And I took it for granted, I feel, growing up, but it is a beautiful, eclectic, diverse but very inclusive community. And there's a reason why artists throughout the ages have settled there and been inspired by it. So it was a really special visit. And Kathy, again, I appreciate so much you guys walking me through it and really opening my eyes to what was literally next door.
Yeah, we are going to put up a video montage of all the amazing pictures that Brian took on his visit to Edward Hopper House Museum. As always, check out the episode page on our website, valleygirlspodcast.com. And Kathy, also anything you want to send me, you talked a lot about the upcoming exhibitions, events, other things that were planned for the museum. So anything that you'd like me to put up, just let me know, and I will certainly get that on the episode page. So anyone interested, you can also check out Edward Hopper House Museum and Study Center at edwardhopperhouse.org. So definitely check out their website.
And follow us on our social media. That would be great too.
Yes, and you're on Instagram, correct?
Hmm.
And
And
Facebook.
Facebook. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I cannot thank you both enough. This is just such a joy to talk to you and just hear more about it. And now I'm excited to go plan my day in Nyack. This is great.
Yeah,
This is great.
please let us know when you're coming. We'd love to
Yeah.
have you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um,
Thank you both so much for joining us
yeah,
today.
you're welcome. Thank you so much. And Brian, thanks for coming to visit. And we look forward to seeing you, Jen, and Jenny at the
Yes.
house at some point in the near future.
For sure.
Well, take care.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone for listening. Please like and subscribe, rate and review, because as we know, it all helps tremendously. Do you love the Valley Girls? Tell a friend. Have ideas for the podcast? Tell us. The easiest way to chat with us is our Facebook group, Valley Girls Podcast Pod Squad, or you can contact us through our website, valleygirlspodcast.com, where you can also sign up for our newsletter so you never miss a thing. And of course, we're on Instagram at valleygirlspodny. We can't wait to hear from you. Oh, and do you love our theme music as much as we do? The music for this episode is by Robert Burke Warren, entitled Painting a Vast Blue Sky, and can be found on his album Red-Headed Friend, available on iTunes and Spotify, and at the link in the show notes. Bye for now.